Michael Swango was a physician sworn to save lives, but behind this reassuring bedside manner lurked a serial killer. Over nearly 2 decades, this once promising doctor poisoned patients and colleagues alike, leaving a trail of suspicious deaths across 2 continents. Estimates of his victim count run as high as 60, making him one of the deadliest medical serial killers in history. How did a man nicknamed Dr. Death manage to hide in plain sight, moving from hospital to hospital, even as patients kept mysteriously dying under his care? Today we explore the chilling rise and fall of Dr. Michael Swango and the systemic failures that allowed him to continue practicing medicine for far too long. Michael Joseph Swango was born in 1954 in Tacoma, Washington, but grew up in the Midwest in Quincy, Illinois. He was the middle child of Muriel and John Swango. His father, an Army officer who served in Vietnam, returned from war struggling with alcoholism and depression, and the family eventually fell apart. Young Michael was raised primarily by his mother, and despite the turmoil at home, he excelled in school. In 1972, he graduated as a valedictorian of Quincy Catholic Boys High School, an achievement that hinted at a bright future. After high school, Swango demonstrated a strong sense of discipline and duty. He enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he underwent basic training in San Diego. Though he never saw combat, the Marines instilled in him a rigorous work ethic and a passion for physical fitness. He was often seen jogging and doing calisthenics obsessively. With his sharp intellect and military background, Swango seemed destined for success in whatever career he chose next. He set his sights on medicine, hoping to become a doctor. In the late 1970s, Michael Swango enrolled at Southern Illinois University School of Medicine to pursue his medical degree. Initially, he appeared to be a brilliant medical student, academically gifted, with a meticulous approach to his studies. Yet even during these early years, troubling signs began to surface. Swango worked part-time as an ambulance attendant, a job he oddly prioritized over studying. He also displayed a morbid fascination with dying patients. Classmates would later recall that whenever Swango was on duty, patients under his care seemed prone to sudden, life-threatening emergencies. In fact, at least 5 patients assigned to him during medical school suffered unexplained code blue events, and several of them died unexpectedly. At the time, these incidents were largely brushed off as coincidences, but in hindsight, they were an ominous foreshadowing of what was to come. As Swango progressed through SIU, his dedication to the idea of becoming a doctor outpaced his commitment to doing things by the book. In his final year, just weeks before graduation, Swango was caught falsifying patient checkups during an OB/GYN rotation. It turned out some classmates had suspected his dishonesty for years. He would claim to have examined patients whom he never actually saw. When this deception came to light in 1983, the faculty committee was aghast. They nearly expelled him for unprofessional conduct, and many felt he was not competent to practice medicine. However, SIU's dismissal policy required a unanimous vote, and one member hesitated to destroy Swango's career. In an astonishing act of leniency, the school allowed him to remain on the condition that he repeat the OB/GYN rotation and complete extra assignments. Michael Swango ultimately graduated in 1983, a year behind his class by the skin of his teeth. This compromise kept his record technically clean, and it meant that despite the red flags, Swango was now a physician with an MD after his name. Fresh out of medical school, Dr. Swango landed a coveted surgical internship at the Ohio State University Medical Center in Columbus. It was 1983, and he had been accepted into a program that was supposed to lead to a neurosurgery residency, an impressive feat given his checkered record at SIU. Notably, Swango's dean at SIU had provided a very negative evaluation in his recommendation letter, warning OSU about Swango's performance and ethics, but the warning either went overlooked or was insufficient to derail his appointment. Against the better judgment of some who knew his past, Michael Swango donned his white coat at OSU's Rhodes Hall and began tending to patients. It wasn't long before tragedy struck OSU's wards. Nurses observed an alarming pattern. Apparently healthy patients started dying unexpectedly on Swango's shifts. These were individuals who had been stable or recovering, yet they would suddenly suffer respiratory or cardiac collapse without a clear cause. Each time, Dr. Swango was the intern on duty. In January 1984, a 69-year-old patient named Ruth Barrick, who had been recuperating well from surgery, abruptly turned blue and stopped breathing shortly after Swango checked on her IV line. Nurses rushed in and managed to revive Miss Barrick, who was left puzzled and weakened by the incident. A week later, on February 7, 1984, Swango was seen alone in another patient's room, that of 72-year-old Rena Cooper, apparently injecting something into her IV. Moments after Swango slipped out, Miss Cooper gasped for air and her face turned a startling shade of blue. This time, quick action saved her life. She was resuscitated and survived to tell her tale. Shaken, Rena Cooper reported that Dr. Swango had been at her bedside with a syringe just before she felt herself choking. A fellow nurse confirmed witnessing Swango injecting something into the IV. Hospital staff grew suspicious. Within weeks, more unexplained emergencies and deaths occurred. On February 19, 1984, Charlotte Warner, 72, was found dead in her hospital bed shortly after a routine exam by Swango. She'd been doing well post-surgery up until that day. The same day, another patient, Evelyn Perani, began hemorrhaging blood from her eyes and orifices after Swango examined her. On February 20th, Anna Mae Popko, just 22 and recovering from an intestinal surgery, suddenly died after receiving a shot from Dr. Swango. Even a young accident victim, 19-year-old Cynthia Ann McGee, who was a college gymnast recovering from a car accident, lapsed into a mysterious coma and died under Swango's care. She had been on the mend for 2 months in the hospital, until one night Swango gave her a dose of potassium that stopped her heart. A nurse had spotted Swango entering Miss McGee's room with a syringe shortly before her condition crashed. At the time, her death was misattributed to complications from her accident. An unfortunate driver was even charged in connection with it, never suspecting a doctor's intervention. On the wards, whispers about the soft-spoken intern took hold. Several nurses bravely reported their fears to the hospital administration. Could Dr. Swango be intentionally harming patients? Administrators, however, were skeptical. The idea that a doctor, one of their own, might be murdering patients was unthinkable. Instead of launching a robust external investigation, OSU officials performed only a cursory internal review in early 1984. Swango flatly denied any wrongdoing, and hospital leaders accused the nurses of paranoia. The concerns were essentially swept under the rug. In the end, Michael Swango's internship quietly ended in June 1984 without renewal. Behind closed doors, OSU decided not to offer him the promised neurosurgery residency, citing his substandard performance as the official reason. Unofficially, they were eager to be rid of him. Fearing legal repercussions if they fired him outright, administrators chose to simply let Swango move on at the conclusion of his internship. No police were ever called, and the suspicious patient deaths were not aggressively pursued. This decision would later be condemned as a grave mistake. A scathing review by an OSU law school dean concluded the hospital should have involved law enforcement and noted glaring flaws in its inquiry. But in 1984, that moment of accountability was still a decade away. Michael Swango walked out of Ohio State University Hospital a free man and with his medical license intact, despite the multiple coffins quietly filling up in his wake. After leaving Ohio State, Swango returned to his hometown of Quincy, Illinois in mid-1984. Unable to secure a residency, he shifted gears and took a job as an emergency medical technician with the Adams County Ambulance Service. It was a dramatic step down from neurosurgery, but Swango still craved proximity to life and death situations. His colleagues initially welcomed the tall, blonde, former Marine. He seemed disciplined and knowledgeable, if a bit odd. Swango often volunteered to bring in coffee and snacks for his co-workers as a friendly gesture. But soon, the ambulance staff began to fall mysteriously ill. Paramedics who drank the coffee or ate pastries provided by Swango experienced sudden bouts of severe sickness, dizziness, intense nausea, vomiting, and splitting headaches. One young paramedic recalled vomiting after eating just a single donut that Swango offered him. The next day, at a football game, Swango handed him a soda. He fell violently ill again shortly after drinking it. These weren't normal stomach bugs. They were acute episodes, almost like poisoning. In fact, the symptoms closely resembled arsenic poisoning, though at first no one could believe that was the cause. As more ambulance crew members were stricken with unexplained sickness, suspicion started to take root. Some wondered if Swango might be tainting their food and drinks. The idea was terrifying. Was the friendly Dr. Swango actually poisoning his friends? Their suspicions were soon bolstered by a strange incident. On one occasion, two crewmen brewed a fresh pitcher of iced tea in the break room, but left abruptly on a 911 call before they could drink it. Importantly, they had added no sugar to the tea. When they returned, they found Swango loitering in the kitchen. He suddenly lunged forward, grabbed the pitcher of tea, and dumped it down the sink without explanation. Perplexed, the medics tasted a few drops that remained. The tea was sweet. It appeared someone had spiked the unsweetened tea with a sugar-like substance while they were gone. Swango's furtive behavior, rushing to destroy the evidence, all but confirmed their worst fears. The ambulance crew realized they might have a predator in their midst. They decided to take matters into their own hands before anyone else got hurt. In a clever bit of amateur sleuthing, a group of paramedics set a trap for Swango. They faked a call that sent Swango and his partner out on an emergency response across town, giving the others time to search his personal belongings. Rifling through Swango's work bag, they made a chilling discovery: a bottle of ant poison containing arsenic, disguised as a sweetener. It was a type of clear solution meant to attract ants, easy to mix into food or drink without detection. This was the smoking gun they needed. Still, the paramedics wanted absolute proof. On another day, two colleagues brewed a fresh batch of iced tea and poured it into 2 cups labeled with their initials, intentionally leaving them out when Swango was alone at the station. They pretended to leave on a call. As expected, Swango couldn't resist. Watching from a distance, they later saw him furtively enter the kitchen. When they returned, Swango quickly slipped away, and the tea, once again, tasted strangely sweet. This time, they preserved a sample and rushed it to a hospital lab for analysis. Tests confirmed the presence of a heavy metal in the tea. Follow-up testing by the county coroner's office nailed it down. The mystery sweetener was indeed arsenic. Armed with irrefutable evidence, Quincy authorities moved in. In October 1984, Michael Swango was arrested by the police. A search of his apartment revealed a trove of disturbing items. The same arsenic-laced ant poison was found, along with an arsenal of chemicals and sinister literature. Investigators uncovered recipe cards for making other poisons like cyanide and ricin, vials of various pesticides and toxins, a collection of guns and knives, and even books on Satanism. Most macabre of all, they found Swango's scrapbook, an album filled with newspaper clippings of car crashes, disasters, and horrific crimes, including articles about the infamous 1982 Chicago Tylenol poisonings. It was as if Swango had been cataloging human misery and taking ghoulish inspiration from it. It seemed this soft-spoken doctor had a morbid obsession with death and chaos. In August 1985, Michael Swango stood trial in Quincy, Illinois on multiple counts of aggravated battery for poisoning his co-workers. The proceeding, presided over by Judge Dennis Cashman, painted a nightmarish portrait of the doctor. Former colleagues testified about his erratic and chilling behavior. Paramedic Brett Unmissig recounted that, quote, "The worse the call, the better Swango would act and perform," unquote, describing how Swango seemed to stay exceptionally cool, even energized during gruesome emergencies. Others described Swango's dark sense of humor. In one incident, he joked about, quote, "going up to the pediatric ward and killing babies with a .357 Magnum," unquote, a comment so shocking that it left his co-workers speechless. Swango later brushed off that remark as a jest, claiming it was merely paramedic gallows humor, but to everyone else it was a glimpse into a deeply disturbed mind. Prosecutors argued that Dr. Swango had used his colleagues as unwitting guinea pigs, not necessarily to kill them, but to satisfy his own twisted curiosity about poisons. Judge Cashman tended to agree. Quote, "Someone could contend that it was a bit unusual," unquote, he noted dryly when discussing Swango's scrapbook of mayhem. The implication was clear. Swango's fascination with death went far beyond normal. The judge surmised that Swango's goal in poisoning the paramedics wasn't outright murder, but rather the perverse pleasure of watching suffering up close. On August 23, 1985, Michael Swango was convicted and sentenced to the maximum, 5 years in state prison. It was a relatively light punishment in the grand scheme of things, but it was the first time he was held accountable. Swango, still proclaiming his innocence, was led away in handcuffs. Judge Cashman later expressed outrage that Swango had managed to slip through the system as long as he did, calling the case, quote, "a cautionary example," unquote, of how trust in the medical profession can be tragically misplaced. Michael Swango served only about 2 years of his 5-year sentence. In 1987, he was released early on parole for good behavior. The convicted poisoner walked out of prison and immediately set his sights on getting back into the medical field. Unbelievably, despite everything, Swango still wanted to be a doctor, and he knew that outside of Illinois, many hospitals would have no idea about his crimes. In the late 1980s, Swango kept a low profile. He worked a series of menial jobs in Virginia, first as a career counselor, then as a lab technician. At the lab, employees inexplicably fell ill with chronic stomach pains. Co-workers didn't know Swango's sinister past, but they found him odd. He was caught on the clock compiling scrapbooks of car wrecks and disasters, the same morbid hobby noted at his trial. Unsurprisingly, he was let go from those jobs. During this period, Swango began courting Kristen Lee Kinney, a nurse he met at a hospital in Newport News, Virginia. Kristen was charmed by the polite, intelligent doctor, and they fell deeply in love. For a time, it seemed Swango might settle into a quiet life, but the lure of medicine, and perhaps the urge to kill, was too strong. By 1991, Michael Swango was plotting his return to the hospitals, this time under an alias. Knowing his felony record would be a red flag, Swango took the drastic step of legally changing his name. He became Daniel J. Adams on paper. Armed with a new identity, he forged a blizzard of documents to sanitize his background. He created a false criminal history report, claiming he'd only been in a bar fight, a misdemeanor, instead of a convicted poisoner. He forged a letter from the Virginia governor restoring his civil rights to imply he was a reformed, upstanding citizen. With polished resumes and fake references in hand, Dr. Adams applied to residency programs that might be desperate for candidates. In July 1992, the gambit paid off. Michael Swango, as Daniel Adams, secured a spot as a resident physician at Sanford USD Medical Center in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. At Sanford, he worked in internal medicine and once again tended patients. Incredibly, colleagues found him competent and even likable. Swango kept his head down and performed well, hoping his dark past would never catch up. For a brief moment, Dr. Adams built a sterling reputation at the hospital. Kristen Kinney, now his fiancée, moved with him and took a nursing job nearby. But even as Swango played the role of diligent doctor by day, ominous signs emerged behind closed doors. Kristen began suffering severe, unexplained migraine headaches. The migraines struck often, accompanied by bouts of nausea, symptoms not unlike those of his prior poisoning victims. Friends would later recall that Swango was oddly attentive to Kristen's health, always offering her vitamins or mystery pills for her quote-unquote stress. Unbeknownst to her, he may have been slowly poisoning the woman he professed to love. Swango's new life unraveled as fast as he had built it. That fall, he applied for membership in the American Medical Association. Unlike the hospital, the AMA conducted a thorough background check. On Thanksgiving Day 1992, a damning discovery came to light. Daniel Adams was in fact Michael Swango, convicted felon. Around the same time, a true crime TV program aired a segment on Swango's 1985 poisoning case, alerting anyone watching that he was dangerous. Alarms rang at Sanford. Horrified that they had a known poisoner in their midst, the hospital swiftly fired Swango and alerted authorities. Panicked colleagues phoned one another, and Kristen Kinney, realizing her fiancé had lied about his identity, fled back to Virginia in shock. Tellingly, after she left Swango, Kristen's debilitating migraines completely disappeared. It seemed she had narrowly escaped becoming another victim. Heartbroken and humiliated by Swango's deceit, Kristen Kinney spiraled into depression. In July 1993, just 4 months after leaving him, Kristen tragically took her own life. When her body was examined, arsenic was found in her system, indicating that Swango had likely been poisoning her slowly, contributing to her physical and mental collapse. Kristen's grieving mother, Sharon Cooper, was stunned and furious that a man with Swango's history had ever been allowed to practice medicine again. Determined to prevent further tragedy, Sharon and Kristen's friends alerted Swango's previous employers about who and what he really was. Meanwhile, Michael Swango had already found yet another hiding place, this time in New York. By mid-1993, under his real name again, he managed to secure a psychiatric residency at the State University of New York Stony Brook School of Medicine. How did he pull this off? It appears that when Sanford fired him, the AMA circulated a warning, effectively blacklisting Swango from American residencies. But Swango vanished before that net closed. Stony Brook's psychiatry department, desperate for residents, accepted him without knowing his full background. Now, unbelievably, Dr. Swango was caring for patients again, this time at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, Long Island, as part of his psychiatry rotation. Predictably, the familiar pattern of death resumed. Over the next few months of 1993, patients at the Northport VA hospital suffered mysterious complications whenever Swango was involved in their care. One veteran, Baron Harris, had come in with pneumonia but unexpectedly lapsed into a coma after Dr. Swango ordered his medication. He died on November 9, 1993, for no discernible medical reason. Another patient, Andrew Woods, also with pneumonia, experienced unexplained seizures while under Swango's watch. He survived, but doctors were baffled as to why a routine case had gone so wrong. The common link, once again, was Dr. Michael Swango, known at Northport by yet another alias, Michael Kirk. Swango's colleagues noticed he was unusually attentive to patients right before these crises occurred, often hovering nearby with a smile. The staff's growing unease turned into action when news from South Dakota finally caught up. Stony Brook administrators learned the horrifying truth that their new resident was a convicted poisoner. In late 1993, confronted by hospital officials, Swango admitted he had falsified his credentials to get the job. He was immediately terminated, and a public scandal exploded. How could a known killer slip through the cracks and end up treating veterans at a federal hospital? The fallout at Stony Brook was swift and severe. The dean of the medical school, Dr. Jordan Cohen, and the head of psychiatry, Dr. Alan Miller, the very people who had hired Swango, were forced to resign in disgrace by the end of 1993. As one of his last acts, Dean Cohen sent an urgent alert to all 125 U.S. medical schools and 1,000 teaching hospitals, detailing Swango's identity and history. At last, Michael Swango was thoroughly blacklisted in American medicine. No residency program or hospital in the country would ever knowingly hire him again. But Swango wasn't done. With U.S. authorities now on his tail and his medical career in tatters at home, he set his sights overseas, where his infamy had not yet spread. In early 1994, as the FBI began investigating the suspicious deaths at the Northport VA, Michael Swango went on the run. He drifted south, laying low in Atlanta for a time with a job as a chemist, until federal agents discovered his whereabouts and he was fired for lying on his application. Anticipating that the noose was tightening, Swango fled the United States altogether. By November 1994, he resurfaced in Africa, in the nation of Zimbabwe. Using forged credentials and calling himself Dr. Mike, Swango managed to secure a position at the Manane Lutheran Mission Hospital, a small rural hospital in Zimbabwe's Midlands province. The staff at Manane were delighted to have a skilled American doctor on board. It felt like a rare opportunity to improve local healthcare. Swango spoke enthusiastically about his mission to help the poor and needy in Africa, charming everyone with his humble demeanor and seemingly altruistic motives. But as one colleague later put it, quote, "Whether it was Africa or America, Swango's murderous desires followed him wherever he went," unquote. In early 1995, patients at Manane Hospital began dying under puzzling circumstances. At least 5 patients who had been recovering well suddenly deteriorated and died inexplicably. Others had unexplained symptoms of poisoning. Survivors all recounted a similar story. Quote, "Dr. Mike was the last person with the patient before they got sick," unquote. One patient had a particularly harrowing experience. Hospitalized at Manane, he awoke one night to find Dr. Swango standing by his bed, injecting something into his IV line. Startled and frightened, he watched as Swango finished the injection, then made a chilling gesture. He waved goodbye to the patient in the darkness before slipping out of the ward. Moments later, the patient's heart began racing and his body felt like it was burning up. Realizing he had been poisoned, he screamed for help. Nurses rushed to his aid, finding him in distress, and they discovered a syringe cap on the floor by his bed, evidence that an injection had indeed been given. Thanks to quick intervention, he survived this attempt on his life. When confronted, Swango coolly suggested that the patient must have hallucinated the whole episode, dismissing the accusation. But by now, the staff's suspicions were grave. The medical director of Manane Hospital, Dr. Christopher Zashiri, grew increasingly alarmed by the pattern of deaths and the complaints pointing to Swango. Not wanting to believe a physician could be a murderer but left with little choice, Dr. Zashiri contacted the Zimbabwe Republic Police. An investigation was launched. Swango was suspended from clinical duties pending inquiry. A search of Swango's cottage on the hospital grounds uncovered drugs and suspicious medical chemicals that could be used for poisoning. This was highly unusual in a mission hospital setting, and it bolstered the case against him. Feeling the heat, Swango hired a prominent local lawyer and even attempted to sue the hospital for defamation to clear his name. While out on bail awaiting further hearings, Swango tried to continue working. Incredibly, he approached a large city hospital, offering to volunteer his services. But doctors there, already wary from the rumors, refused to let the stranger near their patients. A surgical resident had noticed Swango snooping around the ICU even when he wasn't on duty and suspected that this American might be behind the unexplained deaths. Thanks to such vigilance, Swango was turned away. Swango then rented a room from a local widowed woman, perhaps thinking a private residence would attract less scrutiny than staff quarters. But even there, his dark compulsion emerged. The widow and a visiting friend prepared a home-cooked meal one evening, and both fell violently ill after eating. The symptoms were classic arsenic poisoning: vomiting, diarrhea, and crippling abdominal pain. The landlady sought medical advice from a surgeon named Dr. Michael Cotton, who immediately grew suspicious. It was too coincidental that this illness struck while Swango was staying with her. Dr. Cotton obtained hair samples from the sick woman and sent them to a lab in South Africa for forensic testing. The results came back with alarming clarity. Toxic levels of arsenic were present in her hair. This indicated prolonged arsenic ingestion, likely administered in small doses, a signature of Swango's methodology with non-patients. Zimbabwe police now had some hard evidence tying Swango to the poisoning. Through Interpol, these findings were shared with the FBI back in the United States. In the midst of the investigation, Swango apparently sensed that Zimbabwe was closing in on him. In late 1995, before the case could go to trial, he fled the country. He failed to appear for a court hearing in early 1996, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. By that time, he had slipped into a neighboring country, vanishing into the anonymous world of locum medical jobs and false identities. Zimbabwe authorities charged Swango in absentia with multiple counts of poisoning. 7 patients, 5 of whom had died due to his actions. For over a year, Swango remained a fugitive moving around southern Africa, but his time was running out. Back in the United States, federal authorities were determined not to let Michael Swango escape justice again. The fact that a former VA hospital doctor was linked to patient deaths meant the Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General and the FBI were deeply involved. They coordinated a global manhunt with Interpol. By early 1997, Swango's trail was picked up in Zambia. Investigators learned he had applied for yet another doctor's job. Unbelievably, Swango received an offer to work at the Royal Hospital in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. He planned to fly there in June 1997 to start a new chapter under a new alias. U.S. authorities saw an opportunity. Swango would likely have to pass through an international transit hub. Sure enough, in June 1997, Michael Swango booked a flight from Africa to Saudi Arabia with a layover in Chicago. The trap was set. As Swango stepped off his incoming flight at O'Hare Airport, immigration agents and the FBI were waiting. They arrested him on the spot in the terminal, taking him into custody in a private room. Though they could not yet charge him with murder, they had enough to hold him on fraud charges, specifically for lying on federal forms and using fraudulent credentials to gain a VA hospital position. Swango was stunned. After years on the run, his freedom evaporated in an instant. From Chicago, he was quickly extradited to New York to face federal charges. In March 1998, Swango pled guilty to defrauding the U.S. government, essentially admitting that he had lied to get a medical job at the VA hospital. This plea bargain was a strategic move by prosecutors. It put Swango behind bars while they worked to gather the far more complex evidence of murder. In July 1998, a judge sentenced Swango to 3.5 years in prison for the fraud and ordered special conditions. Swango was forbidden from ever preparing or distributing food or drugs, even while incarcerated. Swango was sent to a high-security federal facility in Colorado to serve his term. Now, with Swango securely locked up, a massive investigative effort swung into full gear. FBI agents, VA investigators, and prosecutors knew they had a limited window, about 3 years, before Swango might be released on the fraud sentence. They feared that if they couldn't indict him for murder by then, this cunning killer might find a way to slip through the cracks again. The team painstakingly re-examined every suspicious death in Swango's past. They exhumed bodies of former patients suspected to be his victims. Autopsies and toxicology tests confirmed the presence of poisons in 3 exhumed patients. Among them was Baron Harris, the VA patient from Long Island. Tests revealed that Swango had administered a supposed sedative that in fact paralyzed Harris and sent him into a coma from which he never recovered. Investigators also uncovered proof of what happened to Cynthia Ann McGee back at OSU in 1984. Swango had indeed murdered her with a lethal potassium injection, contrary to the heart failure he had listed on her chart. By mid-2000, the government was finally ready to strike. Just 1 week before Michael Swango was due to be released from prison, on July 11, 2000, federal prosecutors in New York unsealed a sweeping indictment. It charged Swango with 3 counts of murder, 1 count of assault, plus counts of making false statements, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. At the same time, Zimbabwe announced they had charged Swango with 7 poisonings abroad, 5 of them resulting in death. U.S. officials had a strategic ace up their sleeve. They informed Swango that if he somehow beat the U.S. charges, he would be immediately extradited to Zimbabwe to face murder charges there, where a death penalty would almost certainly await him. For Michael Swango, the game was over. Facing a mountain of evidence and the prospect of execution in Africa, the 46-year-old former doctor decided to cut his losses. On September 6, 2000, in a Long Island courtroom, Michael Swango pled guilty to murder. In a plea deal, he admitted to intentionally causing the death of 3 patients, Cynthia McGee, Baron Harris, and a 3rd victim, and to committing wire fraud by lying about his past. Swango did not admit to the dozens of other suspected killings, but by now the pattern of his crimes was undeniable. At his sentencing, excerpts from Swango's own notebook were read aloud, ghastly passages where he had gleefully described the excitement and power he felt watching his victims suffer. Hearing these words, even the seasoned federal judge, Jacob Mishler, was repulsed. He declared Swango beyond rehabilitation. The court formally sentenced Michael Swango to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The former doctor, now a convicted serial murderer, was to spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. He was remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons and eventually sent to ADX Florence, a supermax facility in Colorado, at his own request. The case of Dr. Michael Swango sent shockwaves through the medical community. It forced a hard look at the systemic failures that had allowed a known predator in a white coat to repeatedly find new victims. Over the years, hospitals and institutions had missed numerous opportunities to stop Swango. At Ohio State, administrators dismissed the nurse's warnings and let him quietly move on, prioritizing the hospital's reputation and fear of a lawsuit over patient safety. When Swango was convicted in 1985, there was no effective national database to flag dangerous doctors, and he exploited that by forging records and changing names. Hospitals in South Dakota and New York failed to perform due diligence. Basic background checks were bypassed or insufficient. In one stark example, Stony Brook's own emergency department sensed something was off about his resume and rejected him, but their psychiatry department wasn't aware and hired him. Communication breakdowns and a lack of centralized oversight enabled Swango's charade. It wasn't until 1993, after the damage was done, that a nationwide alert finally went out. Moreover, Swango benefited from what investigators later called blind trust within the medical establishment. Colleagues and administrators found it almost impossible to believe that a doctor, someone sworn to do no harm, could intentionally kill patients. This disbelief gave Swango cover time and again. He also took advantage of the tendency of institutions to handle problems quietly and internally. When one hospital dismissed him under a cloud of suspicion, they often did not thoroughly warn the next place. In essence, each institution was content to see him leave, assuming he'd no longer be their problem. This professional courtesy, as journalist James B. Stewart later wrote, amounted to a blind eye turned toward clear warning signs. Michael Swango's case directly contributed to reforms in how hospitals vet and share information about physicians. By the late 1990s, the National Practitioner Data Bank was being more widely used to track disciplinary actions and malpractice history nationwide. Swango himself was a catalyst for tighter background checks. By the end of the saga, every U.S. medical institution knew his name, and procedures were adjusted to ensure that future doctor deaths would find it much harder to hide. The fact that Swango was linked to at least 35 suspicious deaths by circumstantial evidence, and possibly up to 60 by FBI estimates, shook doctors, regulators, and the public alike. Medical schools began to emphasize ethics and reporting. Hospitals improved peer review and incident reporting systems. In prison, Swango will never again touch another patient. Now in his 70s, he spends his days in a concrete cell, far from the wards and emergency rooms he once prowled. He reportedly maintains his innocence on some charges, yet in other moments he has boasted about his expertise with poisons. The full scope of his crimes may never be known. Some families of patients who died under Swango's care still wonder if their loved one was one of his unnamed victims. Michael Swango's horrific legacy serves as a grim reminder of the vigilance needed in healthcare. It underscores why trust must be earned and verified, not blindly given, and why speaking up about suspicions is essential, even when the suspect wears a stethoscope. The story of Dr. Michael Swango is not just the story of one man's evil, but also a lesson in accountability. It asks us to consider how many times warning signs can be ignored, and at what cost. In the end, it was a combination of brave whistleblowers, diligent investigators, and a bit of luck that finally stopped Swango. His case prompted soul-searching and change in the medical world, to ensure that no doctor like him will ever be allowed to poison the vulnerable under the guise of healing.